Listening to my friend Gary Anderson on Night Dreams Talk Radio, the best in paranormal radio.
Well, we try to be better than some, and we're not as good as others, but what can we say? Thank you, John. Hey, in the news, South Korea sends the first train to North Korea since the Korean conflict. That is very interesting. Denmark now plans to isolate refugees that come into their country to a remote island. And greenhouse gases emissions rise like a speeding train this year, 2018. What's that tell you? Well, the people who keep saying, well, climate changes are not happening, well, maybe they should stick their head in a gas oven. I don't know. Hey, right after this, we're going to have Mark Gober on, and we're going to have an interesting conversation for the next hour. And by the way, you're listening to Night Dreams Talk Radio Network. And don't forget this weekend, we got a couple great shows. Mike W. Hall, he will be talking about UFOs. I believe he also has Peter Davenport on the show. And then we have a new host, James, will be on talking about, well, the paranormal. I'll be back right after this.
Please check out the Night Dreams Talk Radio website at www.nightdreamstalkradio.com. Also, if you want to keep our show free of advertising, just hit the donate button. Give $1 or $2. Remember, all prior shows are always free to listen to. We at Night Dreams Talk Radio thank you for your support.
Well, here it is, down at the compound. Well, we had blue skies today, but I'll tell you, it was really, really cold. I don't know what this winter is going to be like. Hey, Mark, where do you live?
I live in San Francisco.
Well,
so we have no snow here.
Now, one of these years you might find it.
I guess you never know these days, huh?
Oh, well, I tell you one thing with the climate. If it starts happening in June, we know we got a real major problem on our hands.
That's right.
Well, Mark, why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, and then actually let's find out a lot about yourself, a lot about your book, and let's get going.
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you so much for having me. So I'm the author of a book that was published in October called An End to Upside Down Thinking, and the subtitle is Dispelling the Myth that the Brain Produces Consciousness and the Implications for Everyday Life. And the book discusses a number of phenomena that some might call paranormal, like psychic abilities and the notion that consciousness survives when the body dies, all of the best scientific evidence suggesting that those things are actually real and not paranormal. So it's kind of a recontextualization of what we think normal is based on a new framework of science. And that's the book, which we can discuss in any detail you'd like. But my background is actually not in consciousness research per se. I work in the business world. So I'm a partner at a firm called Sherpa Technology Group in Silicon Valley, where we advise technology companies on their innovations and their business strategy. Prior to that, I worked in investment banking with UBS, a large global investment bank based in New York. But I was there from 2008 to 2010.
No,
so right in the middle,
you were
right during the crisis.
Yeah, you were there. Hey, can I ask you a real quick question, since you were in the banking thing? From, the tariffs that our president put on, China, it's, I got a funny feeling we're going to have a ripple effect. A lot of the economists say, Well, in about 6 months, we're going to go into a recession. What do you see? I mean, since you were in the baking, I'm sure you kind of pay attention to the economy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm probably maybe more sensitized than others to recessions because my career started during the biggest one in recent history. So that was my starting point looking at the economy. But I think when anything like a tariff or other measures are put into place, the effects are not seen overnight. It's kind of a ripple effect over time, and it's generally hard to predict these things specifically because there's so many events that can happen that we just today we don't know the future. However, the market has done really well in the recent past, and when the market does really well, history has shown that there have been corrections. So I think a correction of some sort at some point probably will happen if history is any indicator of the future.
Well, I sure hope it doesn't happen like last time because, I had a real good retirement fund. You notice I use the word I had a real good retirement fund. It was like gone.
I know it was a crazy time, but historically for long-term investors, the stock market has proven to be a prudent place to put money, but it's a matter of being able to withstand the ups and the downs and kind of taking that long-term horizon when you look at the investments and not get too caught up in the ups and downs on the day-to-day basis.
Yeah, but if you don't have the money to do that, that's where the problem develops, Mark.
People say cash is king in the finance world, and that what you just said is a good reason why. I mean, you have cash, it's there, it's guaranteed. Whereas if your money is invested, you never quite know what can happen to it.
Oh yeah. So here you were in banking, then you went into business. What you're doing, consulting, and all that stuff. How did you come about writing this book? What got you into it? Is it something that just hit you in the middle of the night, or is it something that was just dwelling on your brain for a period of time?
Well, the specific topic itself came up for me in August of 2016 when I was listening to podcasts, and they first exposed me to these topics. But I think more generally, I've always had big questions about life and existence, even dating back to my undergraduate years where I studied at Princeton. I thought about majoring in astrophysics there because I wanted to understand the universe. What are we doing in this huge universe? What's our place here? Does life have meaning? Those were the kinds of questions I was asking myself. But I was on the tennis team at Princeton, and I was later the captain of the team. It was very demanding, and I wouldn't have had time to do both astrophysics and tennis, so I ended up studying other things. So I think the interests have been there for a while. It was in August of 2016, though, that I really got pulled into it. And like I said, I heard a podcast in August of 2016. It was a woman who talked about psychic abilities, that she was able to communicate with non-physical entities, that she had psychic abilities, that she worked with energies. And these were not things that I had ever heard of beyond science fiction. So I remember just being a little bit interested in that. It was a health podcast that I was listening to. So it wasn't even a paranormal show. It was just an alternative health podcast. At the end of that show, the woman who spoke, her name is Laura Powers. She said, well, I have my own podcast called Healing Powers, where I interview other people that have had similar experiences, and we talk about psychic phenomena and other metaphysical concepts. At the time, I was looking for new podcasts to listen to, and that caught my interest. So I decided to download the Healing Powers podcast on iTunes, and during my drives from San Francisco, where I live, to our office, which is down in the peninsula, so it requires a drive on the 101 highway, which can have a lot of traffic.
Oh, yeah.
So that gave me an opportunity. Oh, yeah, that's right. And it has not gotten better with the tech boom here. But I needed a new podcast, so I started to listen to that one. And at first, it was just kind of entertaining to hear people talk about their experiences with psychic phenomena and other things like it. And I remember it kind of hit me a few weeks in. Wait a second. These people are all describing very similar things, and they're not connected to each other. So something's going on. Either they're all delusional, and what I'm hearing is just some common delusion that the human brain creates, and that's what these people are reflecting, or there's some truth to these experiences. And if that's the case, then what does that mean about how I think about life and reality? And just to give you some further context on me, the way I used to think about reality was based on what I think science is teaching in the mainstream, which says the reason that we are conscious. So right now, you and I and all of your listeners are aware. We have this subjective inner experience that is undeniable. It's a feeling of being alive. And we call that consciousness. I would have assumed that that experience is a byproduct of things that are going on in my brain. So lots of chemical reactions happening in my skull, and it produces this consciousness that I'm experiencing. So that has a few implications if you buy into that, which I used to. Number one, it implies that our consciousness is confined to our biological system because that's where it's coming from, so it's just happening in our body. So our consciousness is local to us. It also implies that when our body and our brain die, so there's no consciousness at that point, because if the brain's the producer of consciousness and the brain shuts off and the body dies, then how can there be consciousness? How can there be memories? So I used to take that very literally of, okay, the body's going to die, and if the body dies, there is no consciousness, and therefore, is there any meaning in life? I mean, does anything matter? Because eventually everyone's going to be dead. So I really struggled with thinking about meaning and just thinking about life. It just seemed like a pretty bleak outlook, but that's what I thought science was suggesting.
Now,
that's where I come from.
Now, I got to ask you a question. How old are you, Mark?
32.
Oh, you're a young kid in diapers. You know, I'm going on 67. You know, I didn't even think about, what you're talking about till I hit like my early 60s. And all of a sudden, these questions that, what things you're talking about, I started thinking about. I started thinking about like, gee, my whole life, everything I learned, is it all been for nothing? I mean, every little thing I've gone through, from my first date to the first time I hit my thumb with a hammer, everything. Is it all for nothing? And, the funny thing is, doing a talk show, and I've been in radio since 1976 on and off. So I've been around for a long time doing talk shows. It makes me wonder, I've had guests on who'll say, well, there's no such thing as all mediums are fake. They set people up to ask questions knowing that they're going to get most of the questions right just by guessing by what, the feel from the conversation of talking to their person. But then, I have a couple of friends that, are into it really heavy. In fact, one of them is going to be a new talk show host on my network starting this weekend. And I'd tell you, is some people seem to know a lot of strange things and feel things that, when you have conversations with them, it's like, wow, you know what I was even going to ask you before I asked you. So I don't know. I'm going to get back to you.
Well, those are exactly the sorts of things that I have begun to explore, and those are the topics that I cover in my book. But I wanted to give the context for where I come from, because this is not my background to even think this way, that things like mediumship, communicating with the deceased, psychic abilities. I was not raised in an academic environment to think that those things were even possible, let alone real. So you can imagine the radical shift it was for me to, number one, even look at these things, which I ended up spending a full year after I heard those initial podcasts of just immersing myself in looking at the science to see whether or not these things could actually be real. And the more